All right, good morning. Welcome to our Encouraging Truth series. Glad you're joining us on this fine Monday morning, because that's when we put these videos out, because we want to encourage you at the beginning of the week so you have something to think about during the week that will point you to something biblical to hopefully help you through your week. So that's the whole point to this particular series. First, if you want to know more about our ministry, you go online to womensbiblestudy.com. There you can learn everything you want to know about us. So today, this is what I want to start with. I want to say this. I want to say I think that the world is changing. I think the United States is changing. I think our government is changing. So the question I want to talk about today is this. Like, as a Christian, how are we supposed to handle that? Like, if the government comes in and starts telling us what we can and can't do as far as like our faith in Jesus, what do we do? Do we have rights as Christians? So today our Encouraging Truth number 56 says this. The Bible says to obey the government unless. Today I want to talk about the unless part about that. But I want to start off here because some of you are going to be really frustrated with what I'm about ready to say. So I'm going to explain it. So don't turn the video off when you hear it. Let me finish explaining it before you get frustrated. But here's what the Bible says. The Bible says that God expects us to come under the authority of the government. And you're like, what? But I'm going to throw in the word unless, and we're going to talk about the unless part of it in a few minutes. But let's find out where we get that from. And it actually comes from Romans 13. The Apostle Paul wrote this letter to the Romans. And this is what he says in verse 1. He says, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities have been established by God. Now, it's so interesting because God says, look, the government that overrules your country or your nation, that government has been established by God. And God says, I expect you to listen to what your government has to say. And that shocks us because we're like, why would God call us to follow a government that opposes God, that opposes the things of God? And that just doesn't seem right to us. But think about this. When Paul wrote this letter to the Christians in Rome, the Christians in Rome were not living under a godly, wonderful ruler at that time. They were living under Nero. Nero was persecuting Christians. He was actually taking Christians, putting them on a stake and lighting them on fire to light the city. It was horrible. But even though this evil was happening, Paul wanted to remind the Christians in that day that they had to obey the government, the ruler. Verse 2, consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Peter talks about this in 1 Peter 2, verse 13. He says, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God and what? Honor the king. For us, it would be honor the president. Now, that's really hard, especially when there are times when the president that is elected in the United States is actually not the president that maybe I think is good for the country. And in total transparency, there were presidents I never even thought to pray for. I'm like, I'm not going to pray for him. And that's wrong on my part. Because the Bible says we're to pray for our leaders and we're supposed to honor them. But I spend more time going, you're not my president, even though he really is. So there you go. But here's the reason why God says that is because God put them there for reasons we may not understand today. God put them there. God put them into office. Daniel 2:21, he changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. And some of you, whether, in our election season, if you're like, well, the election was fraudulent or whatever, he's the leader. As right now, it's President Biden. And God raised him up for such time as this. I don't know why, And for those of you that, didn't like Trump, you're like, yay. But if you wanted Trump in, you're just like, I don't get it. But the bottom line is, it doesn't matter. That's who's president. And God says, I have raised him up for such a time as this. So, knowing that that's what the Bible says that we have to do, then that's what we have to do whether we like it or not. So, let's get to this next part. God expects us to come under the authority of the government unless, and here's the unless part, unless what we are asked to do conflicts with what God has said in his word. In other words, if the government came to you and said, we're making this new governmental mandate. You're never allowed to marry someone from the opposite sex. Now you have to marry someone of your same sex. If they did this governmental mandate that you need to abort all babies that are little girls. If they come up with this mandate that says you need to quit going to church, never allowed to go to church again, and you need to bow down to a statue of President Joe Biden. What if they say you're not allowed to share your faith or you're going to go to prison? I don't know. Whenever things like that go against what God has already says, then God says he rules over that government. I'll show you a couple examples. In Exodus 1, we have the Egyptian Pharaoh, very, very powerful man. And he commands 2 Hebrew or Israelite midwives to kill all the male Jewish babies that they were, these women were having babies. The problem was Israel, Israel as a group, the nation, the Hebrews, they were getting to become such a big people group, it was terrifying Pharaoh. So he's like, we need to start killing off the baby boys. And so he told these midwives that they have to, when the babies are being born, that they're supposed to kill the babies. Well, I'm sorry, but the Bible tells us that God is against killing people like that, let alone, babies. I'm sorry, we're not doing that. But the midwives knew this, so they disobeyed the government. Look at Exodus 1:17. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. See, because what the king told them to do went against what God had already said, to decree. We see this in Exodus 1 verse 20. He said, so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. He blessed them for going against the government because of something that he said was what overrode whatever the government had to say. You don't go killing babies. That's not what God's wanted. So we see this again in Joshua 2. Rahab, there's a woman, Rahab, the king of Jericho. 2 spies went into their camp, and Rahab hid the spies. But the king was like, I need to know where these men are. Look at Joshua 2 verse 2. The king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. Even Rahab, who received a clear order to turn these men over, she resisted. She's like, no. And the reason that she did is because she feared God, and she knew that God was going to do something. And what happened was God saved her and her family when Joshua came in and the Israelite army destroyed Jericho, but saved Rahab. So we go, well, she disobeyed the government. Well, she did. She disobeyed the king. But because God had said to do something different. So there are times that we have to go, okay, what does God have to say about this? We see this in 1 Kings 18. We see a man by the name of Obadiah, and he feared the Lord greatly. But Queen Jezebel, wicked queen, she was killing all of God's prophets. So Obadiah took 100 of these prophets and hid them so that she could never find them. Well, that was a defiant act against a ruling authority, but God overrode that. We see this in Daniel. There's a number of different civil disobedient examples from Daniel. We find the first one in chapter 3 where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar builds this big statue, and you're supposed to go bow down to the statue. But they're like, I'm sorry, we're not doing that. We can't. We bow down to God alone. And then in chapter 6, there was another time where Daniel was told he's not allowed to pray to anyone but the king. And he goes into his room and he opens up the windows and he prays 3 times a day to God. He's like, sorry, not doing that. See, in both cases, God rescued his people from the death penalty because they followed him, and which overruled the kings at that particular time. So hopefully that's kind of making sense. In the New Testament, we see it in the book of Acts. We see Peter and John. Peter healed a man born lame, and so they were arrested. They were arrested for preaching about Jesus, and they were put in jail. And the religious authorities told them to stop talking about Jesus. You're not allowed to do that anymore. But look at Acts 4, verse 19. But Peter and John replied, judge for yourselves whether it's right in God's sight to obey you rather than God, for we cannot help but speaking about what we have seen or heard. Acts 5:29. Peter and the other apostles replied, we must obey God rather than men. Now, the reason I want to talk about this today is because we talk a lot about, in this Bible study, about the end times, and we do a lot of end times conferences and stuff like that. And if you don't know anything about what we do, we put out a few videos on the rapture, because I do not believe that we're going to be raptured out of here before the 7 years of tribulation. So I think it'll happen. We'll be raptured somewhere after the midpoint in there. But my whole point is that we need to be prepared, because a man that we know of as the Antichrist will come on the scene. He'll have his little sidekick. He's called the false prophet. The false prophet's going to show up. He's going to be nice and persuasive, and he's going to do everything he can to deceive people. Even Christians they're going to try to deceive. But we know that the Antichrist and the false prophet are actually empowered by Satan. We read this in Revelations 13:11. He says, then I saw another beast coming out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. He exercised all the authority of the first beast on his behalf, and made the whole earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose fatal wound had been healed. And he performed great miraculous signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to earth in full view of men. So what we see here is that we see this false prophet. He's going to be out there preaching about the Antichrist. He's going to be healing people, raising them from the dead. Turning water into wine. Anything to make people think that he really truly is like the Messiah. And Christians will see that and they'll be like, oh, wow, this must be of God. Verse 14 says this, because of the signs he has been given power to do on behalf of the first beast, he deceived the inhabitants of the earth. He ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. See, it will be the false prophet's job to force everyone to follow and worship and bow down to the Antichrist. But if you are a follower of Jesus and the government says you have to do this, like, the president, let's just say, gets up and says, oh, all of you need to go down and worship the beast. You're like, I'm sorry, I can't do that, because we believe in God. We worship only God. And so this falls into the category of you have to decide if your faith in Jesus is real. That's the main thing. Is your faith in Jesus real? Because if it's real, you will refuse to listen to the governmental authorities, and you will refuse to bow down and worship anything other than Jesus. So the false prophet does this. Verse 16, he also forced everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on his right hand or on his forehead, so that no one could buy or sell unless he had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom. If anyone has insight, let him calculate the number of the beast, for it is man's number. His number is 666. So this is where we see what's known as the mark of the beast. And you'll be forced to take the mark if you want to buy anything or sell anything. And you won't be able to purchase gas or food or anything unless you have this particular mark. But the mark is not about buying or selling. The mark is actually, it's about who you will follow and worship. That's what the mark's about. And as a follower of Jesus, you'll know this because there's this line in the sand that says, if you take this mark, and if you obey the law of the land, the government, the president, whoever's telling you have to bow down to the Antichrist, then really what happens is you're saying, I'm not a follower of Jesus. I'm not really truly a Christian. And God says, you're not a child of mine. See, God has made it clear we don't bow down to anyone but Jesus. And we're going to have to stand up against the government and say, absolutely not. So the bottom line today is this. The Bible says we have to obey the government unless what the government is telling us conflicts with what God has said in his word. GotQuestions.org says this. Christians should resist a government that commands or compels evil and should work non-violently within the laws of the land to change a government that permits evil. So we should do things, but we should do it, according to the government, and do peaceful protests or whatever we need to do to make that happen. Civil disobedience is permitted when the government's laws or commands are in direct violation of God's laws and commands. The next one is, if a Christian disobeys an evil government, unless he can flee from the government, he should accept that government's punishment for his actions. And the next one is, Christians are certainly permitted to work to install new government leaders within the laws that have been established. So there are ways that we do it, but we do it working with the government unless it comes up against what God has already told us. So, knowing that this is all coming, we say, what do we do? And I always say this, you got to make sure you're a Christian. Like, you really need to make sure that you truly know Jesus. And understand this, it's not a prayer, it's not just, oh, Jesus, come in my life and I get to go to heaven. It's not. Making a decision to follow Jesus is a life-altering decision. It changes everything in your life. Because here's the deal, if you live during this 7 years of tribulation, and if I'm right, and we do have to go through the first half of it, then following Jesus could actually mean it will cost us our life. Which means, if confronted with a leader or a government saying that, we have to do something against God, we refuse, we may die. We may have to face the consequences of what that looks like. But here's the deal. That is what following Jesus is all about. It's about giving our life to him no matter what. So all that to say, our encouraging truth number 56 is this. The Bible says to obey the government unless the Bible says to obey the government. We might not like it, but you know what? We may hate to wear face masks or hate to go the speed limit or hate it if we're placed under a curfew. But if it is mandated by the government, then God says we have to respect their authority unless they're asking us to do something that goes against what God has commanded in his word. So hopefully that helps you today. I hope you have a really wonderful week.